tempting to think of pop culture as being characterized by contemporary fads. Indeed, when we asked several dozen people to think of pop culture influences, pretty much all respondents mentioned celebrities, singers, or YouTube vloggers, most of whom had only become famous relatively recently. Certainly no one mentioned names from the classical era of Hollywood. So while those are certainly valid ways to think of pop culture, insofar as there can even be an invalid view, there's another direction from which it can be approached, one which we believe merits elaboration. To wit, many aspects of pop culture are in fact influenced by classics, and that indeed such works may be considered pop culture in their own right. In addition, concepts, themes, and ideas that enter our minds as part of pop culture are not restricted to singular mediums of entertainment that interest us. In other words, pop culture has the potential to impact the ideas and perceptions of society in ways that we might not even be conscious of.
That is a pretty bold claim. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so a quintessential example which encompasses all the aforementioned claims is J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the high fantasy novels The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Tolkien was born in 1892 and was raised in England, although he was actually born in South Africa, which is pretty interesting. While teaching at Oxford University, he wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which were published in 1937 and 1954 respectively. He was inspired by ancient European myths and really lamented the fact that England lacked a national myth. He passed away in 1973 at the age of 81.
So how is Tolkien relevant to pop culture?
This goes back to societal perceptions. The following clips are dwarves in pop culture: Disney's Snow White, Blizzard's Hearthstone, and Hobbit Battle of the Five Armies. Take note of their accents.
We know who we are. Ask her who she is and what she's doing here.
Yeah. What are you and who are you doing? What are you? Who are you, my dear?
Oh, how silly of me. I'm Snow White.
Snow White?
The princess?
Yes.
Welcome back, boys. Look who it is. Oh, it's good to see you again. Come in and shut the door. It's cold out there. Warm your frozen boots by the fire. Have you seen the weather out there? Oh, at least it's warm in here. Welcome. Boys, make some room by the hearth, won't you? Welcome to the inn, friend. Welcome to the inn.
Stand down before any elf. Not least this faithless woodland sprite. He wishes nothing but ill upon my people. If he chooses to stand between me and my kin, I'll split his pretty head open. See if he's still smirking then.
Gear out in the nick of time, as always.
Zoltan, with your boot to someone's ass, as always. Who were those men?
Local colour. I wasn't gone more than a moment. Long enough for them to turn our home into theirs. All right, time for some spring cleaning. I've got to boot them all out. Care to join me?
With pleasure.
Notice the stark difference in their accents. In the clip of Snow White released in 1937, the same year The Hobbit was published, the seven dwarfs all have working class accents. But in Hearthstone, The Hobbit, and The Witcher, all 21st century releases, the dwarfs have stereotypical Scottish accents. Why is this so? Well, according to Dominic Watt, an expert in forensic speech science, cultural associations are responsible for this phenomenon. In his writings, Tolkien crafted an elaborate world and an entire fictional mythology to accompany it. Each race had its own distinct cultures, societies, languages, and traits. The qualities Tolkien incorporated into his writings for dwarfs generally exude a sense of Celticness and tend to be stereotypically associated with the Scottish accent. Case in point, both Scots and dwarfs are thought of as having a fondness for drinking and brawling, as well as a tendency to be brutally blunt and straightforward. In a similar vein, elves in fantasy tend to speak with a crisp, upper-class English accent. An odd choice considering the fact that elves came into fantasy from Norse and Irish mythology. This too can be attributed to Tolkien. In Tolkien's world, elves are the firstborn race of Arda, with culture and skill that far surpass anything the greatest man could hope to accomplish. Traits associated with them include an aloof demeanor and, owing to their immortality, wisdom, as well as a general attitude of superiority. Consequently, the very first radio adaptation of The Lord of the Rings depicted elves as having a very distinct received pronunciation, a result owed both to their character traits as well as to Tolkien's English background. Thus, we see how ideas and concepts are not bound to their mediums of origin, even as something as seemingly outdated as an 80-year-old novel, which many people have never read, influences modern television and video games. Another area in which Tolkien's thematic and conceptual impact is keenly felt in pop cultural perceptions is in his invention of the Elvish language. A professional linguist, Tolkien constructed numerous languages for the different races, including two distinct Elvish dialects, Quenya and Sindarin, as well as an original alphabet for them, Tengwar. Ever since then, virtually all fantasy series featuring elves have some form of Elvish, even if it's not explicitly referred to as such, for they are often depicted speaking a different language than the common tongue, and it tends to sound extremely similar. In fact, the very presence of Tolkien's constructed language being used in 21st century video games and films is a direct impact in its own right.
Nani hir gelar Mordor, Ivab gelebren Iachotha Ivorn, Tridaol Hith Efuen, An Achared di Werienin Anan, Erio Thelaeth Gwrth, Edwenno Ogwath, Trilaich Puigadol Dagor, Nathadir Edwegenin Inaudir Edil, Nunamnin, Natha Tognir Inain, Iwath Dangarnen.
Levate Larena Lunet.
That's him. That's the elf.
Arveg var Ledi. Sirel. Ni forda sol eser min. Ein sila kelpi.
Adathanas Elgara Masula Eva Venan.
Bear in mind that these franchises have absolutely no relation to each other beyond being the same genre. In addition to accents and languages, Tolkien's works have also been hugely influential in other authors, including George R. R. Martin, the author of the immensely popular fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire. This may be more widely known by the title of HBO's massive hit TV show Game of Thrones.
Although Song of Ice and Fire features much darker themes and plot lines than The Lord of the Rings, and the focus of Martin's work differs substantially from Tolkien, Tolkien's influence in this area is nevertheless manifold. From a literary standpoint, Martin has referred to Tolkien as his great model in terms of the plot. If you look at The Lord of the Rings, it begins with a tight focus and all the characters are together. Then by the end of the first book, the Fellowship splits up and they have different adventures. I did the same thing. Everybody is at Winterfell in the beginning except for Dany. Then they split up into groups, and ultimately those split up too. Then Tent was to fan out, then curve and come back together. The similarity of character names in both series are no coincidence. Martin has explicitly stated that Samwell Tarly in A Song of Ice and Fire is an homage to Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings. Khal Drogo is named after Frodo's father, Drogo Baggins. Valar Morghulis is phonetically lifted from Tolkien. In Tolkien's Legendarium, the Valar are gods, and Morgul means black sorcery as in Minas Morgul. Moreover, from a literary standpoint, readers of the original novels can easily spot Tolkien's influence in A Song of Ice and Fire books. Thorough world building, a defining trait of Tolkien's books, one which he pioneered, occurs in both works. A great deal of The Lord of the Rings consists of Frodo and Sam, two key characters, simply walking around and exploring Middle-earth, and some of Tolkien's critics charge that he focused too much on the world instead of the plot. Yet, in A Song of Ice and Fire, characters slowly meander through Westeros, one of the continents in the known world, taking their time. In both cases, the story takes a backseat to the world in which it takes place, and in both cases, the authors delve deeply into the fictional histories in order to create a rich and elaborate backstory. To be sure, there have been fantasy series that buck the trend and contain absolutely none of the tropes invented or popularized by Tolkien because its authors disagree with Tolkien's approach. Yet, even such cases are a testament to the indelible mark Tolkien left on fantasy and pop culture. For in order to consciously rebel against an idea, one must first have an idea in mind. Also, more recently, in November of 2017, Amazon announced that it had acquired TV rights for The Lord of the Rings, and so the road goes ever on and on.
As someone from foreign country, English language books and TV shows are of little interest to me. I do not read fantasy and I do not watch American TV. Are there any other areas of entertainment in pop culture which bear Tolkien's influence?
Absolutely. Some of the most popular video games of all time, such as Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, and World of Warcraft, were inspired by Tolkien's works. Fantasy in every medium, not just television and books, owes its popularity to Tolkien. The popular fantasy game, Dungeons & Dragons, is a perfect example of this, as the original format of the game was so similar to Tolkien's universe that the Tolkien estate demanded it undergo drastic revision. As Dr. Tom Shippey, a professor of English literature, fantasy, and science fiction, writes, Tolkien did not invent heroic fantasy, but he showed what could be done with it. He established a genre whose durability we cannot estimate. The multi-billion-dollar video game industry has virtually unanimously adopted Tolkien's vision. For instance, in World of Warcraft, the most powerful RPG ever, worth over $10 billion in annual revenue, elves are divided into subraces, an innovation of Tolkien's. Likewise, the cliché of a small group of good-hearted underdogs that we see in the original Final Fantasy follows an incredibly similar pattern to that found in the Fellowship of the Ring. This is but one of the numerous clichés which became increasingly popular only after the publication of Lord of the Rings. Simply put, the video game industry owes much of its most memorable and successful titles to Tolkien. Beyond this, Tolkien has even had an impact on the music industry. Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and Black Sabbath, some of the best-selling artists of all time, have all released tracks either inspired by or as a direct tribute to Tolkien's Legendarium. There is even a persistent theory that Stairway to Heaven, widely acclaimed as one of the greatest rock songs ever, contains references to Lord of the Rings in its lyrics. While we may never know the truth of the matter, what is known for certain is that Robert Plant is a huge fan of Tolkien, and wrote several songs based on Tolkien, even naming his dog Strider.
Ultimately, Tolkien's legacy remains among the most enduring influences in popular culture, 5 decades after his passing. It would probably be simpler to state the areas in which he did not have a palpable impact. Essentially, one of Tolkien's biggest contributions to the genre and to pop culture is in the idea of creating a mythopoeia he called it. Prior to him, the very notion of creating a shared history for a collection of otherwise unrelated tales would have been unthinkable, a massive undertaking hardly worth the effort. Yet Tolkien understood the value of having a common backstory to bind each individual tale together, and this is the feature which now permeates fantasy in all forms.